Welcome to the Talent Equation Podcast. If you are passionate about helping young people to unleash their potential and want to find ways to do that better, then you've come to the right place. The Talent Equation Podcast seeks to answer the important questions facing parents, coaches, and talent developers as they try to help young people become the best they can be. This is a series of unscripted, unpolished conversations between people at the razor's edge of the talent community who are prepared to share their knowledge, experiences, and challenges in an effort to help others get better faster. Listen, reflect, and don't forget to join the discussion at thetalentequation.co.uk. Enjoy the show.
So another long overdue guest, Ben Franks. Welcome to the Talent Equation Podcast.
Afternoon.
Been great. It's great to get you on. We've been threatening to do this for some time. We've been exchanging some interesting dialogue with some interesting people on Twitter of late, and all that sort of stuff. But I guess the starting point is just give us the backstory. Tell us about why you are wrestling with this messy world called ecological dynamics. How did you arrive in this whole space?
I kind of fell into it. I did an undergraduate in sport coaching at Oxford Brookes because I was a failed footballer, not because I had particularly strong academic interests. I was never particularly academic at school. I did a standard kind of one of those college scholar link things for semi-pro football clubs, and I went to uni to be a PE teacher really. And it's kind of the work of Will Roberts and Danny Newcomb on my undergraduate that kind of got me into the ecological side, and then just a massive dissatisfaction with what coaching was. I could then start to legitimise why I was a terrible footballer because I've been taught or coached badly rather than so I think just kind of immersion.
Well, that was part of it, yeah.
Yeah, it was the main reason. And it just grew from there. It was something I was interested in. It was quite a new and niche area, and I think philosophically it just seemed to fit a bit more with kind of how I viewed learning and almost kind of broader interaction based stuff. Stayed on at Brookes, did a master's by science in research. Mm-hmm. On the quiet eye, so looking mostly at kind of visual gaze and loosely an ecological interpretation of the quiet eye in performance environments, and looking mostly at kind of critiquing perceptual methodologies. Traditionally in perceptual research, it's mostly isolated and controlled, and variables are managed to get kind of external validity, but trying to push that more towards an ecological validity in terms of looking at research so we can actually interpret the results and apply that back to the natural habitat the individual or the participant should be demonstrating those behaviours in.
Yeah.
So my master's thesis mostly looked at...
Not lab-based then? Where possible.
Not lab-based, so trying to get into the field, which obviously has its difficulties and it's more difficult to control, and the data the sample was much smaller than I'd have liked it to be, just because it's amazing how bad professional footballers are actually hitting the target. See a season's worth of data collection in a slightly more dynamic trial, like a 1v1 situation between a goalkeeper and a striker. And a good 80% of the sessions were collecting the balls back in where they'd smashed them wide of the post. Actually getting them to hit the target was the hardest part of data collection. So the sample was really cool because they were terrible.
This was probably a problem that you didn't necessarily envisage.
No, not at all. I thought it would be easy, stick some glasses on some goalkeepers. But no, that was a whole faff. And then in September, I got my first full-time lecturing job at UCFB in Wembley, which offers very niche football-specific undergraduate degree programs. And I teach it on football coaching, sport coaching and business, and the PE programs.
And cool.
Now I'm here.
Wow, awesome. So, just going back to your kind of you mentioned earlier on your history and you kind of you describe yourself as a playing footballer, a failed footballer. Were you playing professionally, semi-professionally?
Loosely semi-professionally. Yeah, it was a.
Every now and again, a brown envelope might turn up if you were lucky.
Pretty much. It was the National Youth Conference.
Right.
It wasn't a bad standard. I just wasn't good enough, really.
So, and in terms of that experience, though, kind of like that young experience, you mentioned about sort of being attracted towards the ecological model because you look back and thought, yeah, God, my coaching experiences probably didn't, your disillusionment with coaching. Tell me more. How, describe that whole thing for me.
So I was a goalkeeper, really, and goalkeeper training is quite strange. The goalkeepers union sort of aspect of it, I've always kind of thought about quite critically. And it's the goalkeeper coaches and their goalkeepers, their relationships are phenomenal. I've never seen anything like it. They're like blood family. It's really interesting. And at the time, it was great because my best mate was the second goalkeeper. Well, I actually think he was the first goalkeeper. He wasn't. He was second. And the coach was a really nice environment to always train in. But the actual training itself, I always found quite strange. It would be lots of traditional block, high volume, lots of repetition, very limited environmental or contextual additions, and it'd be times you'd spend an hour and a half session and you'd have made about 70, 80 saves in a very small period of time, but they'd all be very similar and quite exactly the same. And then I'd always wonder why they didn't always translate to the game performance. Like make a basic error in handling and I go, I'll make that save 3 days during the week. I'll do that for 2 hours over and over again. I won't drop one, but put it into a game and all of a sudden I've dropped one and I could never quite work out why that was. And then when I got to uni, started looking at some of it. I think it was one of Savelsberg's two early papers, which was the first thing I'd ever read in goalkeeping research. And that's kind of what got me hooked in trying to push this further and really starting to understand what goalkeeping should or could look like. But yeah, that's kind of where it all started.
Did you say Savelsberg?
Savelsberg, yeah. He's got a chapter in that first David's book. Yeah. Renshaw's book, The Motor Learning Practice. So that's the first. I think I read that chapter, then went back to one of his papers.
Okay, and so just kind of. So you've decided to obviously, so going through this process, your research has focused in on this whole idea of this concept of called the quiet eye. So we're going to need to explain that for people because there's a lot of people out there. And if in fact, it's only recently because we were both at the Expertise and Skill Acquisition Network ESAN conference recently, where I actually got a better understanding of what the quiet eye was, what I thought it was, what isn't what it was. So tell me about that a bit more. Explain that.
So there's lots of different interpretations of it, and this was the fun part of my Viva, was kind of looking at all the different interpretations of what the quiet eye is. Right. So it's basically the final fixation someone will make towards an object in the visual feed prior to a movement. Mm-hmm. However, that's in intercepted actions. In kind of self-paced target aiming sort of actions, that quiet eye period often continues into the movement as well, and is broken down into two separate stages of the quiet eye. But for what I was using it for in interceptive actions, like goalkeepers saving the ball, it's simply the last fixation before a movement is started towards that interceptive action, so towards saving the ball.
Right.
It's argued whether it's kind of there's two interpretations of it. The traditional information processing argument, where it's perceive information, process, and act. Or there's now the ecological interpretation of that, which is it's more about kind of that online control of movement where we can constantly update. I don't know the word update and processing because it's quite computer area, but constant online feedback to update the visual feed with that information that's constantly occurring. And then we act based on that constant interaction with the information in the field.
So that's the almost the direct perception piece rather than the information goes into the brain, brings about a motor output.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So it's happening. Essentially, the proposal being that within the, I guess, the ecological account, it's I guess a synergy, a consistent synergy between, I guess, proprioception, visual field, etc., constantly happening in real time, rather than the idea of, right, that's happening, I'm now going to go into my memory bank of stored movement patterns. There's the one I need. I'll bring out that movement subroutine. Now I'm going to perform the action. That's the conception, the information process and conceptualization of the way it would work, right? Have I got that right?
Yeah. So I had this conversation with Greg Wood yesterday. I was kind of the first 10 seconds starstruck that he was speaking to me, because he's kind of one of the big guys in the quiet eye stuff. And most of this stuff is from that more information processing perspective. So it was quite interesting to try and discuss with him the differences. And neither of us really could put an answer on it. But I think how you summarize it there in terms of the visual information is used to recall schema, or recall a mental map or a mental image to then act on it is, I guess, the original interpretation in the golf putting studies from Vickers. Right. Is the quiet eye fixation, when it's successful, is extended as they basically update the schema and then causes a motor action.
Right. Now, I was under the impression, so for me, it's the term quiet eye that's interesting. So I'd read some research once when I was working in golf and interested in sort of golf skill ac. And still am, around the idea of that. The idea was that you didn't put too great a focus on the ball. Like, so back in the day, people used to say, look at a dimple or look at the number. So you're really focused on the ball to then, bring about the impact point, or look at the back of the ball or whatever it might be. Whereas in reality, what I think they've discovered now is you actually don't want to have that kind of fixated look. What you want is to have a more general area or a general perception of there is a ball there in that space. And actually, I've come to realize that that's a far better, more impactful way. I thought that was the quiet eye, almost like a softer focus, maintaining attention in an area, but a softer focus. But what you're saying is the quiet eye is actually about the settling on the point of the object, which you are either intending to intercept or aim to or propel towards a target. Is that right?
Yeah, that's how I see it. I think some of the traditional stuff was more based on the specific gaze at a specific location, like a dimple of a golf ball. But that's one of the criticisms of the quiet eye, I think, was that it was almost too reductionist to the point. It can't simply be just that minute location we're taking information from. That must be like a visual anchor. Yeah. And then we take multiple information sources from around that area. Right. So one of the things we found in my master's in terms of expert goalkeepers, they used loads of different information sources, but it mostly ranged between the ball or this area called the visual pivot, which is kind of like an area around kind of the knee when it's flexed and the ball. And It supposedly captures loads of different temporally constrained pieces of information as the leg extends, as the hip rotates, and as the ball leaves the foot. So that's kind of where the quiet eye interpretation of it being more of an area of interest, and then lots of information from around that area is then extracted. So
you discovered in your research that they're looking either at the ball or this space have you coined that phrase, the visual pivot?
Oh, no, it's been around for years. It's
okay.
I'd love to be able to claim it. But it's the first time I've really seen it in the research in situ environments.
Okay.
It has been used more, and that's partly because the task we used was more representative and hadn't been used before.
In previous tasks that they'd used for these kinds of studies, what would they have been? A bit more, less dynamic?
So typically in situ trials, it was the ball. There was loads. Traditionally, it was used on 2D screens, and they'd either do a kind of a really novel motor action, either they'd point or move a joystick, verbal answer, and in some cases they'd do a full body movement. And the gaze fixations were either at the ball or like the actual kinesthetics of the body and different body parts. Then in 2010, Matt Dix did a really interesting study comparing the 2D image display versus in situ experiments, and then broke it down further between the actual responses. So be it verbal, small action or a live action. And across the domain, there was significant differences in what was fixated and the general search patterns across those environments.
So just let me clarify that. So those two different experimental so he cross-referenced a in situ and a kind of a real world scenario, and this kind of isolated task environment that's more lab-based, let's say. And he cross-referenced and he found significant differences in gaze behaviour between the two tasks.
Yeah, and typically in the in situ trial, they'd look at the ball more often than any other part. And the explanation to that was because it's real and your body is synced to that information.
Yeah.
Typically, goalkeepers look at the ball because it is it's the projectile, and it might be a gaze fixation that goes to that because it's a real object they can act on.
Yeah.
And it becomes more of a guess, I think, or a very, very advanced movement. Whereas in the in situ, the video trials, where the information is less consequential, because you're not embedded in that environment, they often looked at parts of the body to extract kind of pre-flight information.
Right.
And it's possibly because the actual movements of the body were less relevant, so it was termed as vision for perception rather than vision for action. The only difference being vision for perception is used in task where the body is not related to the task, whereas vision for action is the embeddedness of my own personal action capabilities in relation to the task itself.
That's interesting. And that was something I took away from Isan, just to sort of reflect on that for a second, was there was such a polarization between what seemed to me to be kind of more ecological in nature types of research, which was very practice led and very much based around trying to explore what we can understand around real world problem settings, versus and very much practitioner led, versus really reduced experiments that really bore very little, in my view anyway, very little resemblance to anything that had a real world application, but told us a small amount about a particular activity that was really quite artificial, and therefore I found really difficult to draw any conclusions from, apart from there's something interesting happening over there.
Yeah, a lot of the EEG work on the quiet eye, that was absolutely fascinating, but what is it showing us, I guess, is the answer, where we can't do the dynamic tasks necessary yet to really understand those kind of EEG studies on the quiet eye. That, and that's a little bit beyond me, is the heavier neuroscience stuff. But typically the criticism of ecological dynamics that we see is, look at this paper, they're using mental models, but then the task is a dot moving across the screen, and it's like, well, that's not really what the ecological approach is trying to answer.
Well, I mean, I would definitely come back to that, because I think it's a really interesting point. I think what I found as well was really interesting about that whole discussion was, and it felt to me like there was definitely almost like two camps sort of in the room, but in a very collegiate way, still trying to like kind of work on the same stuff, but very much coming at it from, I think, there was a discussion around the difference of language and understanding each other's kind of terminology. But I think there's also a big difference sort of epistemologically. And what I mean by that is, like, you've got the starting point for people working in that ecological space is, look, there's practitioners who've got problems. Let's see if we can try and solve those. Now, we might not be able to do it perfectly scientifically, but what we can do is give ourselves enough to be able to say, there's something of interest that we can now explore even further, right? So there's a bit of that. And then you've got on the other side, that sort of more neuroscience, that cognitive side, cognitive neuroscience stuff. They're not really starting from that real world problem necessarily. What they're trying to do is, the starting point is, right, there is a human being who performs skills, and we're going to start from the perspective of that skill happens in the brain. The brain is the governor of everything. So again, I mean, that's very different from the ecological sense, because we're always talking about environments, whereas they're talking about what's going on in here. So they'll put people into lab-based scenarios, because you can't do this stuff outside yet, because we haven't really got the tech, or if you want it, you need to go to NASA or somewhere like that. So it's beyond the reach of most university budgets. So we do what we can with what we've got, with its inherent limitations, and go, right, something's happening in the brain when someone does that. And when an expert does it and a novice does it, they do something different. And I go, okay, I'd expect that. Yeah. But what do we then, to the bit that's in the middle of that is, right, well, what do we now need to know that the novice needs to do in order to become more expert? And it never answers that question. But conversely, my criticism of the ecological explanation, I can see as well, is that what we tend to do is we look at observations in situ, and we go, well, when people do these kinds of things, they tend to develop these kinds of action capabilities. When they do these kinds of things, they do these kinds. But again, we don't know anything that's going on phenomenologically underneath. And I almost feel like if we could somehow put researchers together, right? So let's get a neuroscientist and your stuff and like kind of lock it together and go, let's work on these two things at the same time, and then compare and then try and pull some things. We'd get some richer stuff. But I'm not even sure that, I don't even know if that's possible, or do you think it's possible?
I think we're all going to end up at the same answer. We're just so far away from the technology to answer it yet. I think a lot of the discussions I've had the last couple of days, we're basically have the same answers and almost the same explanations, just different language, different mechanisms of understanding it, and different epistemologies.
Yeah.
And there's going to be a meet in the middle at some point, and it's going to be amazing.
Yeah.
But in the meantime, like ESAM was the last couple of days, it needs to be much more just a nicer space to have those discussions.
Yeah.
No one was harming anyone for being ecological or cognitive.
Yeah.
It was actually lots of very beneficial discussion, and seeing the more isolated cognitive stuff, I'm sure it is really valuable.
Yeah.
And will offer something to the ecological interpretation, because the criticisms of ecological interpretation who say the brain's not involved, well, obviously the brain is involved.
Yeah.
But argue we don't know enough about how the brain is involved yet, which I think is a reasonable criticism.
Yeah.
In the same way with the really isolated cognitive stuff is, yes, you know lots about how the brain works, but we don't know how the body works in that situation or in a more dynamic environment, for example.
Yeah.
So I think everyone's on the same side, just in different spaces. And when they're drawn together, we'll start to have something more beneficial. But I just don't think we know enough about either side yet to say this or that. However, in the applied sense, there is more in terms of an ecological interpretation that's supportive of applied practice and applying some of these kind of practical kind of constraints and approaches and that sort of stuff in these real environments to show, well, it's kind of quite important, the contextual information and the space that they're existing in. We've shown it's quite important. So let's maybe try and push it further and make these links to cognitive stuff rather than just saying, no, you're wrong or you're not applied or you have no idea about science. And I think we're all on the same side, just in different spaces.
Yeah, and that's where I think some of the misunderstanding comes from, though, because I think that I even heard that in the discussion yesterday, where there was, I heard one of the cognitive scientists who actually brought this up, said, look, I'm actually really interested in this stuff. I really want to be able to help and contribute. But I was a little bit came away because their suggestion was, well, just come and talk to us. I'm a bit like, well, that's not really how it works. You guys need to come and talk to us. But you see, because the starting point is understanding what's happening inside a human, then they're not really thinking of it from that kind of applied context.
Yeah.
Which is why it's very interesting to me as well that the cognitive science stuff tends to center very, 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 very thoroughly on the science, whereas the ecological stuff tends to think much more on coach and practice. You hear coach a lot, because what you guys want to understand is, what are the processes here? What could somebody in charge of designing learning towards expertise take from this information and effectively use? Whereas on the other side of it, it's more really saying that here's an observable thing that might be of use to somebody, but that's not really what that's not really the starting point.
Yeah, I think it's a fair call to make. And obviously the scientific part of the ecological stuff, I have a fairly good grasp of the ecological dynamics area, but the more upper level kind of like Ludovic's Seifert's work, even I was a bit stretched when I was kind of trying to get in and understand some of that stuff. And I think if that became more accessible, the argument becomes more accessible for everyone, because the ecological stuff is very difficult to understand at kind of the upper level academic area, and like anti-phase and all that sort of stuff. I'm getting lost with it. So no doubt people who don't really read ecological dynamics that often have no idea about it, or don't even know it exists, because it's difficult.
Yeah.
And to really start understanding the scientific embedding of ecological dynamics, more needs to be done in trying to translate it. And I worry where it is so complex at the moment, trying to translate it, as has happened to constraints-led approaches stuff, it just gets diluted to the point of there being too many holes in it, and then it's easy to pick apart because we don't know enough about it.
So is that something that you you've really delved into this probably more than most, certainly more than most, and you see that, do you, that there's a tendency perhaps with the way, say, practitioners or policymakers or kind of people in charge of coach education scheme, whatever it is, that they're picking the bits out of ecological dynamics that they kind of get and understand, and in so doing maybe devaluing it slightly? Is that right? Or
I think so, and that's not a discredit to anyone. It's more just of an observation that, and it happens to, I've done it as well. I think the form of life stuff is a really good example of it. The original interpretations of it are very different to what it has become in the ecological dynamics domain. I'm still not 100% convinced by it, but it's almost become like an argument to say, oh, it was just kind of some of the cultural stuff that surrounds them, and everyone has their own form of life, and that's a constraint. And it's like, well, yes, but what? And each form of life surely is linked and contextualized. And I think there's a lot of things that have been bled into the more public domain of ecological dynamics and coaching, which we don't fully know yet, and is being utilized as a tool without a thorough academic understanding and research-based understanding of it yet.
So what's your interpretation of form of life? How does it differ?
I don't see how it's different to just being an organismic constraint or an environmental constraint in Newell's model. I just think I understand why it's been interpreted as something different in terms of being a form of life, and it's a more collective cultural understanding of the individual. I don't see it being any different to being categorized already by Newell.
So some people have tried to take, if I understand what you're trying to say, is some people have proposed that Newell's triangle, which is task, individual, and environment, yeah?
Yeah.
Good job I could remember that, innit? Task, individual, environment, and there is a fourth, so it's a diamond, right? There's a fourth point that goes down, which is socio-cultural. Is that right?
I've seen it drawn like that. It makes really good sense, and I've seen it used really well in places. I'm just not sure we know enough about it yet. And I've had these conversations with people like Danny, and I don't get to talk to him as much anymore because I'm not in Oxford, but I'm still not totally convinced by it. I get it makes sense, but I'm not convinced it's helping people yet, because we don't know how the form of life actually exists.
My understanding, then, maybe I have been misinterpreting it, but my understanding of form of life was kind of, and I sort of understood this it made intuitive sense to me, was the idea that depending on your situation, look at it a different way, your situation, i.e. how you're employed, how many people you've got around you, all these sorts of different things. You're right, they're environmental constraints. But they're not purely environmental in the sense of, I always think of environmental constraints being more about for example, things like weather, surface, those sorts of things. Whereas the cultural structure you're not always as in control of. And so they do affect how an individual might behave. So, for example, somebody in a private school where winning matters is more likely to behave, i.e. your employment and therefore food on the table and your security and all those sorts of things where winning matters, because if you don't have that, you're out of a job. They're likely to behave and interact and perceive activity in a certain way, more so than somebody in an environment that doesn't have those kinds of challenges and pressures. And I've operated in both. And I can tell you the difference in terms of the way it affects me, even though I know all this stuff. For me, it's something very real in terms of its impact, but I can't put my finger on why and how and all that sort of stuff. But I might be just misinterpreting the research.
No, that's exactly how I've interpreted. I just think, how could that? I think we're adding another model to models we don't already understand. How can does that explanation not just fit nicely into Newell's triangle in the first place?
Yeah, right. Yeah,
and we've got one less thing to worry about then.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, again, so that's the argument I've heard before made by various people about this idea of like scientific parsimony, the idea of, we've got to look for the simplest explanation. Why are we overcomplicating the triangle? Actually, you've got environment, you've got the individual, you've got the task at hand. Actually, that's the only explanation we need. Why do we need to overlay socio-cultural dynamics?
Yeah, I've heard really convincing arguments for it. I'm just a bit pessimistic of it. But
natural skeptic. I think. What about on the socio-political level?
Oh, I completely see its value in terms of different kind of individuals from different political climates, or etc., and how that impacts their path. Maybe it's maybe it's been used wrong. Maybe it should link more to the form of life as the pathway towards being involved in sport, rather than. I've seen it try and get used around the skill act level, and that's where I'm a little bit fluffy with it. But if we just use it as an explanation of how they get to where they are, I'm not sure how it links to the actual practice itself that Newell's model doesn't already offer.
Okay.
And there's some Wittgenstein's original theory, and some of his stuff on it's really interesting. And it seems to be it's another concept adopted from outside the sport, brought into sport, and molded and shaped to fit sport. And I think that's just where my issues lie with it. But I can see its value, and I've seen people like Mark uses it really well.
Yeah.
And to be fair, I'm hoping I get the commission for this, but Ian, Keith, Danny, and Will's latest book, if you've not bought it, it's available on Amazon. That explains it really nicely. I'm just yet to be totally convinced by it in an academic sense. Right.
Okay. Well, I mean, again, it's like all of this stuff. It's an area that we are still exploring actively, and we'll get different interpretations and explanations. That's a rabbit hole we've just gone down. I'll pull us back out.
Complete tangent.
Let's get back to footy. Well, I told you it's an emergent conversation. I never know where we're going to go. So anyway, just flicking back. So let's come back to this goalkeeping piece, right? So we've now got back to this idea of you've got vision for perception rather than vision for action. Now I can hear people screaming at me going, what? And I've got to be honest, I'm going, what? So I need you to unpack that a bit.
So typically we see vision for perception in tasks where we perceive an environment but aren't physically embedded in that environment.
So on a screen, like a video game type of thing.
So your typical brain training or cognitive eye training based computer analysis tools.
Got it, yeah.
Is vision for perception.
Okay.
Which is where the argument around kind of brain and cognitive training methods kind of on your mobile or on a laptop don't transfer particularly well into tasks because they lack that task specific and that action embodiment. Vision for perception is where we then start to perceive things that are related to our actions. So in Dick's 2010 study, what we perceive and the information we interact with changes because now our actions are related to that environment. How we pick up information therefore changes to allow for the individual constraints of my body and how I can interact with that task itself. In vision for perception trials, typically they'll fixate or use different information in that visual field because they don't have to worry as much about their body being involved. I.e., if I have a joystick response, there's less of a temporal issue or a time constraint on how I can get or intercept the ball, because I don't have to physically intercept it. I just have to pick a direction. Whereas if I actually have to dive to the top corner to get that ball, I have to leave significantly earlier. If I can't leave significantly earlier, I'm not going to save it. So that's why vision for perception differs in terms that we can perceive things that aren't totally relevant to me. They might be more generic visual sources we can use for a task.
Okay.
I can't remember the study off the top of my head, but it was a I think it was late 60s, maybe early 70s, that showed that in video tasks, experts were less successful than they would be in situ tasks, because they knew their own requirements of their body and how to interact with that information in real life, compared to just being on a video screen and not being as linked to their body.
And because it's on a video screen, so you've got the body perspective, right? There is something to do with our body.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it feels to me as well that because that two-dimensional nature of a video screen, even if you did have to do something with your body, the two-dimensional nature of the video screen feels to me like it would have different perceptual richness to it. I don't know if that's the wrong word, but you know what I mean? Depth and stuff like that, and sound and
different,
yeah. And so because of that, it would make you move and probably look at stuff differently as well, I'd have thought.
Yeah, so at the basic ocular level, we perceive entirely differently. So it was Goodell and Milner who discussed I'm just now, I can't remember it, ventral and dorsal streams. So they're two visual mechanisms which are a really basic understanding associated with different perception-based tasks. So in 2D displays, the ventral stream is more linked to that 2D image because it's based more around that vision for perception. Yeah. The information that stream picks up is more related to just perceiving the environment in its natural raw form, whereas the dorsal system, which is more linked to perception, vision for action, is more linked to the actual invariance and task specifying information. So then how we act is then different because of that disassociation between the ventral and the dorsal networks.
Right.
Really poor explanation of it.
It'll do for our purposes. You know, I'll take it. So essentially what you're saying is there are different ocular systems.
Yes, pretty much. And the 2D screen compared to an in-situ live situation requires a different engagement with those perceptual streams.
See, that's where an ecologically what's the word I'm looking for? Somebody who's researching, like yourself, from an ecological perspective or an ecological framework is, we'll owe a debt of gratitude to somebody who was willing to study ocular, what's going on and discover that there are, different ocular systems that we can then to use as because that would have been some sort of really very lab-based experiment, wouldn't it? That then we can then use and then translate, and it can actually help us with it as part of an explanation for the sort of stuff that's going on in this very much this field-based stuff.
And I think Goodell and Milner are quite enthusiastic for the info processing stuff. So it surprises me that the info processing world is still doing 2D image display experiments that don't really show what perception is.
Why? Because if you were trying to, for example, or you were trying to prove or you were trying to test a hypothesis around information processing, you would have taken it into a more real world landscape. Is that what you're saying?
You'd like to think so. You'd like to hope that they were treating the information as natural as possible if they were going to transfer that to an actual task which is representative of the habitat the individual lives in.
If they were, so there's a one. I hesitate. I don't want to speculate too much here, but if there was a field there that's potentially looking to preserve the integrity of a field of study through repeating the same experiments over again and getting the similar results, that's not good science, is it? The idea is you're supposed to disprove your own theories, aren't you?
Depends how you define science, I guess.
I can't go down that rabbit hole. Anyway, so what I was going to say to you there, right? Okay, so we've got this vision for action, right? Yep. And in the vision for action, there is this. If I've understood what you said, not only are we tapping into different visual systems, ocular systems, so there's a different part of the the way, I suppose there's a different kind of system in terms of, if we are going to talk about kind of the way the brain is interpreting the information that's coming in via the eyes, but that is also happening synergistically with what we are sensing, both kinematically, proprioceptively, and also our other senses, what we're hearing, seeing. It's all happening at the same time. Now, your research probably doesn't go that far, but is that sort of the suggestion that's being made here?
I think that I don't know the real ins and outs of the neural network bit of it, but yes, I think the senses bit is really important, partly because of the memory recall problem. It has to be sense-based because that is live and it's happening immediately. That's why that's maybe where the issues with the schemas and recalling memories to kind of generate actions. I think that's where the issue comes, because we don't have enough time to draw on previous memory or previous schematic things. Why that senses argument, I think, is so important for the ecological approach, is that it's live. We act on what is happening in that moment.
Yeah.
That's not to disregard memory.
Yeah.
But the focal point is it's that constant interaction with real information, real senses that are happening at that moment.
Well, my sense as well about the idea of that we would have this, again, that's the schema idea is still driven by this information processing. We're a computer. The idea that we can store away these motor programs and call upon them when required, when we see something that equates to something we may have seen before. How comes this subroutine? Well, that would work in every case, unless that would work it might work, in something that was super repetitive, but in something dynamic, never changing, that's never going to be the same, ever.
Yeah, and I've been playing with this for ages, and I can't get my head around it, but this decision-making must happen at different levels. I remember playing and thinking quite consciously about what I'm seeing and what I'm thinking, and there is that metacognitive element around strategy and tactical patterns. But I think the more temporally constrained decision-making comes, I think is where the ecological dynamics route becomes more significant. And almost possibly where this whole... I had this conversation with Par on Twitter around the top-down against bottom-up processing stuff. It's just a bit of a false argument, maybe. It doesn't really exist. It's not either one or the other. It must be a scale somewhere along the lines. If I'm at right back and I'm currently not involved in the play at the time, but I can perceive certain invariants and make me want to move, that perceiving those invariants may then support some of the broader, more conscious tactical decision-making around strategy, possibly. Everything must link together in some way around the different levels of control we're in. But I think personally, for skilled, temporally constrained actions, it is purely an ecological and information is perceived and acted on experience, because it happens so quickly. And we're able to reinterpret and respond to those actions in moment.
Temporally constrained, you mean time-bound?
Time-bound, yeah. Bad habits.
It's fine. I'm happy to ask the stupid questions, mostly because I like to check my understanding. I actually agree. I mean, Keith David sent me a really interesting paper. I had a similar question for him when I was at Movement Scale Acquisition Ireland last year, and about this idea of this whole top-down, bottom-up. And he sent me a really interesting paper, and I completely forget the reference point. And I'm still working my way through it a little bit, but the notion that I was reading in that was this idea of synergy. So there's a flow, a constant flow, kind of up, down, and across. But I'm very, particularly in the embodied cognition standpoint, I'm very, very intrigued by the idea of action as led by sensation and perception, more so than a cognitive process. Because I don't know about you, right? But how many I have definitely in my lifetime, and this might just be my explanation, but even before I knew anything about ecological dynamics, right, I have done things in games, right, and had absolutely no explanation for how I did it.
Yep.
I just like it just happened.
And it's funny you say that. The goalkeeper, we kind of did some it wasn't part of the research, but more like kind of like a half-assed stimulated recall with the goalkeepers after the research and saying, well, what did you look at? And they were pretty much always wrong. They had no idea what they were looking at when they made a save.
So what they said they looked at, they weren't looking at?
No, some of them were nowhere near.
Really?
And
you knew this because you had the glasses to show where they're gazing? Yeah.
So we tracked the data, and then afterwards I had a quick flick through and just to have a brief look. But yeah, they had no idea. So in terms of actual skilled action in the moment, surely cannot be a kind of schematic representation, or because it happens at such an, I hate the word conscious or unconscious, but it does happen at such an unconscious information bound level.
And actually therefore there could be, and actually this was brought out a little bit by Seifert. I thought his research was fascinating, by the way, and I talked about it with Ollie Logan earlier, which will be the podcast before this one. And he talked about this idea that, like, so when you're given a kind of a technical instruction with a kind of a movement solution, so in your case, it might be classically keep your eye on the ball or whatever, right? That actually brings about more levels of movement variability.
Yeah.
I really want to know that for me, that's kind of like a fascinating thing, isn't it? Why would that happen when you give somebody a technical instruction, which you would assume would actually over constrain them to a particular movement pattern? They actually move in different ways. That is a really, really interesting finding, I thought.
And speculating, I don't know the area massively well, but is that because the information they're specifying from that kind of explicit instruction is an action bound?
Yeah.
So variability in the action occurs because it's not necessarily bound to the task.
Exactly. Whereas, that for me, I think we could draw a potential conclusion there, which was because he did have a group that was given a task. So the two that were given constraints, one was an auditory cue, which said only move when you hear the sound, and the other one was count for 2 seconds before you do the movement. So kick, count for 2 seconds, pull, right? So given task, far less variability, still enough variability to be exploratory, but within a more acceptable kind of bandwidth, let's say. Whereas given an action instruction, how to do the movement, it's all over the map. So for me, we might be able to draw a conclusion that lack of task specificity in either an instruction, a question, an action, whatever it might be. Yeah. So the task-led approach in this kind of context may well be the way to go. Now, the question, I suppose, is keep your eye on the ball a task, or is it an action statement?
I mean, well, it's nonsense because we can't actually track a moving object that goes that fast. But
right, okay. So a goalkeeper can't track a football kicked at. You were doing penalties, weren't you?
Yeah, penalties.
They can't track the movement of a ball.
So they'd fixate on it when it was stationary or in the very early stages of the movement because the ball remained in a relative position to visual feed. But as it moved out of the eye line and the goalkeeper had to move the eyes to track, they'd make saccadic jumps, so basically gaze jumps into almost like a predicted location of where the ball would go. Okay. Compared to actually track it or smooth pursuit tracking of the object. And that's been commonplace since, I think it was 1956, by McGill. And it was baseball hitters, and they couldn't actually track a moving baseball because just the speed of the ball moves faster than the eyes can move and maintain a smooth fixation.
So they're making a prediction based on what they're seeing.
Prediction. Arguably making that prediction based on the pre-flight information, and then jumping to where they think it might go. I think it's been observed in cricket as well.
And so what you describe as the pre-flight information, is that what you're talking about? Is the actions immediately before the ball is struck?
Immediately before and as connection. So if they fixate on the ball, I imagine the information around the angle of the ankle approach, the actual contact on the area of the ball, the first ball movement, because typically the ball moves so faster than the goalkeeper can move themselves, so they have to move prior to foot to ball contact. But what I find interesting is that they maintain that gaze which again I think supports an ecological interpretation, they maintain that gaze to then allow for readjusting or recalibrating their movement.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah.
Which then I think challenges the schematic argument.
So they can adapt. So they're adapting and making a sort of almost like trajectory adjustments in their gaze. So they're thinking it's not going where I thought it was, it's going somewhere else, and they're constantly making those trajectory adjustments.
Yeah. So but I think that's I think Rob Gray's done quite a lot of it in terms of online control.
Yeah.
That's a brief explanation, but I think it shows support for an ecological interpretation of how information is perceived and acted upon in that moment. Well,
it makes a lot of sense as well, because if we can imagine that through, I'm doing an action now like I'm saving a ball, but if we were to it's not good radio, but if we were to imagine that in the middle of the action we are receiving a flow of information based on what we're seeing, what we're feeling, hearing, what our body's telling us, it makes total sense to me that as I was reaching across to make a save potentially, I would I'd have to not just be thinking the ball's going there, I need to do this. I'd have to be thinking, and when I say thinking, I don't mean consciously thinking. I mean, there'd have to be something happening that's making me go, my body's in this position, that requires this. And so my gaze behavior would change according to where I was in flight, because my body's obviously in flight at this point. You have to imagine I'm athletic enough to take off the ground. I know it's a reach, but go with it.
Across the room at the
Yeah, so in flight, however fleeting that flight might be, you have to imagine that I'm perceiving what's happening to me, and whether that is going to correspond to the sort of intended trajectory. And that's going to be happening we're talking even shorter than milliseconds, aren't we?
Yeah, I think it was Rob Gray again. I think he tweeted the video of the baseball fielder making a prediction to where the ball was going and looking away from the ball.
Isn't it brilliant?
Just loaded an argument. And the ball dropping short because I think they discontinued their gaze on the ball or the area that the ball was moving in.
Yeah.
So if we do have generalized motor programs that can be adapted and adjusted to different actions, then surely the field of air would have taken account for that movement in the ball, rather than making such a large prediction based on a assumed schema, because information is so present in terms of making an action.
Yeah, I'll dig that out. Actually, it's a good video. I'll try and put it on the link to the show notes. Yeah, because he basically jumps up on the barrier, doesn't he? Because he thinks it's going to be a home run, and he jumps up to try and catch it, and it lands short, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Brilliant. So in terms of then, right, where I'm a keeper, I was told by someone when I was being a keeper, not a particularly effective one, but I was told that I should look at the foot plant, because that would give me a clue as to where the ball might be going. But turns out not so much, eh?
Well, I guess it depends on the intent. Is the information from that planted foot may still be having an impact. So the quiet eye gives a visual anchor. Doesn't mean the information surrounding that anchor isn't relevant. So just because they fixated the ball, that may also include the information present in that planted ankle. I think penalties especially, I always quite deliberately looked at the planted foot, because strikers have never been the brightest of the footballers, and they tend to make it quite obvious where that foot's pointed.
Well, it made sense to me that there might be a clue there.
And to an extent, it's basic biomechanics.
Yeah.
If the ankle aligns that way, the hips will go that way, and I guess movement then follows that kind of pattern down the body.
Yeah.
But so maybe the visual anchor that goes near the ball or near the visual pivot captures that surrounding information as well, because it's still in that immediate eye line as such.
Well, Abernathy stuff, and then that's been borne out. We saw lots of research on anticipatory stuff, like Dave Alder's stuff, and that it's borne out, isn't it? That actually the skilled performer really isn't looking at the object that's likely to be propelled at them. They're looking at a load of cues prior to that point, giving them almost like a a split-second advantage, and they're going off that, and they're making a read basically, aren't they? Because they can't, like you say, they can't physically just wait until the ball is struck and then think, now I'm going to move, because it's gone, it's past them.
I think it's a lot of the research that generalises gaze behaviours has shown that.
Right.
But it's another part of my masters. We're looking at the actual individual variation of gaze. So a lot of the quiet eye stuff, especially, generalises the mean fixation length and fixation location.
Right.
And assumes that as to be the gold standard for experts.
Oh, okay.
But what I found, and Harry Ramsey, who was at ESAN as well, I think he found in his basketball free throw stuff, is a significant individual variation between people when they do skills.
Right.
So we found some goalkeepers looked only at the ball for really, really, really early in the trial. And then some goalkeepers looked at the visual pivot quite late on. So I think now that gaze is so linked to the body that just looking at perceptual research is becoming less valuable. Right. Because if there is individual variation between gaze fixations, which are linked to the body, we kind of kill off any generalized look here for skill performance.
Right.
So speculating, goalkeepers that look at the visual pivot, who then move later, arguably are more capable athletes specific to moving. So because they can afford to move later, they can afford to wait to perceive more up-to-date information and then act on it. So they may be quicker, they may be bigger, they may have, my physiology is terrible. They may just be able to jump further in a certain direction and then interact. So that's why the vision for perception stuff is so important, because it's so linked to the body.
Yeah.
Goalkeepers that looked at the ball really early on maybe did that so that they could actually see the object itself that's going to be launched at them and try and make more of a guess based on that.
How many participants do you have?
Oh, minimal 8 across all the different experiments. So that specific experiment itself was only 4, but they were 4 professional full-time goalkeepers.
Right.
Across about 100 trials each.
Were you able to, for example, so there's a few questions in that. Let's just take that one with 4. Were you able to, for example, say that a goalkeeper with this kind of physiological, you probably haven't got this data, but let's just go on based on their observable physiological makeup, their morphology, so to speak, height, musculature, etc., and all that, and general athleticism, where they look versus where a different kind of goalkeeper with a different kind of morphology would look.
So that's hopefully my PhD come September.
There you go. We're looking forward to that.
All the data, because they were pro goalkeepers, it was completely blinded. Just so there was nothing that, if there was a data leak, not that it was the end of the world, nothing could be traced back to whose goalkeeper it was and all that. So we didn't.
Although I tell you what, depending on who the goalkeeper was, it might explain an awful lot about what's going on in the world of the Premiership at the moment. Not that I'm suggesting any of those were your subjects. But anyway, couldn't resist. So the other thing I was going to ask you was, are you able, because you've obviously got a lot of trials, you might not have a lot of subjects, but you've got a lot of trials. So you've got quite a big mass of data, and it may be that it needs just the analysis done. But were you able to go on successful trials, there was a tendency for gaze to be here versus on unsuccessful trials?
So we didn't track that, partly because as much as I thought about it, I had no idea why that was. Because it happens across all the quiet eye literature. As in successful tasks, they have relatively consistent gaze patterns. But in non-successful tasks, gaze is kind of everywhere. And subjectively, in my study, when they didn't make the save, like their fixations were in the weirdest of places, but there was no explanation for it because it's the same task.
Right.
And
of course, it could be that the other person just booted it down the middle straight at them, for example. So you've got to take into account that variability.
Yeah.
You need a load of data, wouldn't you? You need a load of, like you say, you're going to need a load of successful trials to go, like on successful trials where the ball was hit sweetly to a certain part of the goal. The goalkeeper, you're going to pick certain type of save out, aren't you? And go, yeah, God, that's so good. The more I think about it, the more I can see the challenge of actually researching in this space.
And and the glasses we used were a little bit invasive because it cut the bottom of the eye. So it could be all number of matters that caused that. And goalkeepers, they piss about a bit.
Of course they do.
So they might have just been, after 8 trials in a row, might have just stopped paying attention for the last 2 and just been looking at the sky.
Yeah.
But I tried to pin Sam Vine down about this at the bar after ESAN, and he gave a really good answer around how maybe the quiet eye isn't the significant variable there, and it might be that the quiet eye fixation itself is different because it's trying to make up for a previous gaze mistake. So the gaze strategy, fixations and pattern before the quiet eye itself may have been different. They may have perceived something differently, or any number of variables, but there's no real set answer on why that is at the moment.
And like you say, it might be also that where the eye fixates on is either because that's what the performer thinks they should fixate on, or they've been told they should fixate on. But actually, the relevant information is all of the other information. Where the eye settles is a very small part of actually all of the information required to make an effective save.
I'll try and do form of life justice now, but maybe the cultural differences in goalkeeping have impacted the gaze patterns.
Okay.
Some goalkeepers are, in certain parts of the country and the world, are encouraged to punch the ball, parry or deflect the ball more often than catch it. So gaze may then be embedded in those actual decisions themselves, whether they want to punch it or parry it.
Right.
The weather itself may make an impact. So, there's an unmeasurable number of variables that might impact when trials are scored. Why that is, we just don't know, or I don't know. Someone else much smarter probably does.
Fascinating, actually. Just while we're dwelling on that subject for a second, is as to why catching the ball has become so out of fashion. Because when I was keeping, again, not particularly, and this is probably just because I was selfish, catching the ball, firstly, I saw that as being a mark of competency.
Yeah. Being
able to catch the ball on a cross, catch the ball when it's shot at you, and not punch it away, get it, hold it, keep it. And the other reason I wanted to do that was because I wanted to gain possession.
Yeah.
I didn't want to give a corner, which is another opportunity for the opponent to score. I didn't want to punch the ball out or parry the ball out to somewhere that I may not have any control of, and then they have another opportunity to score. I just said, I want that ball to be secure with me, and then now I'm an active part of the attack, and I can start an attack off, potentially.
I think certainly in the UK, it's very focused around technical proficiency, hence the repetitive block practice in goalkeeper training. So maybe technical success is defined as maintaining possession of the ball. So therefore, English goalkeepers like to get the ball because it's technically correct.
Right.
Goalkeepers in especially Spain, for example, I don't know this for certain, but it seems to be there's less focus on technical competence and more on just keeping the ball out the goal. Hence, typically Spanish goalkeepers, their movements are slightly more functional in relation to the task rather than them being the prescribed model of technique,
like De Gea, who's very topical at the moment, but making as many saves with his feet as he does with his hands.
Yeah,
which would not be a traditionally technical model. It would be seen as a bit unorthodox.
Yeah,
yeah,
and maybe that is, I think different.
By the way, that translates in hockey as well. Hockey goalkeepers, if you took a British goalkeeper, they would be seen as being that you would see them perform certain actions in quite an orthodox technical way. Whereas if you look at, for example, a Dutch or a Spanish keeper, and I can think of 2 in particular, Ronald Janssen and Kiko Cortez. Cortez, I think, is still playing, and Janssen's retired years ago. But they used to do things literally like save the ball with their backside, because they've sort of slid and adapted to the action and just kind of managed to get something in the way that you just wouldn't see. I wouldn't have said anyway, I'm probably being slightly unfair, but you wouldn't see with the British keeper, because they would more be kind of like standing. And I have to say, the way that the quality of goalkeeper training or goalkeeper coaching generally, I mean, I don't know about football so much, but certainly in hockey, has a huge lack of imagination. I think it's quite a challenging thing to be imaginative with often, because you want to try and be representative, but sometimes gaining representativeness doesn't give enough goes for a participant. But anyway, what I see a lot of is, genuinely, you're talking like players in the talent pathway, goalkeepers, standing more or less on their line, more or less, just waiting for shots to be hit at them and reacting to it. The craft of goalkeeping, the dynamics of being an active part of a defence, and considering the way you might manage the actions of an attacker in order to gain yourself an advantage, they've just gone out the window. It seems like it's not even considered in any form of coaching or stuff like that.
Football goalkeeper coaching is improving, but I still see a load of goalkeeper coaching practice where the ball is static and then struck at the goalkeeper. And my research isn't masses of data, but even we've shown that just changing the variable, like the ball moving before being struck, changes gaze patterns. So surely when you're then in the environment itself, how often is the ball actually static when a shot is fired, other than set pieces? When the ball's in play, it's either struck first time on the move or touched out the feet then struck. So I think what we're preparing goalkeepers for traditionally, I don't want to generalise because I'm sure there's loads of excellent coaches, but traditionally what I see is it's all very static, not in motion. Are we then preparing their perceptual cognitive skills for the wrong task?
Yeah, because and part of the reason I think that the delivery is static is partly because I think the coach feels that they need to deliver the ball well to the same spot to give the repetition. So if they move too much, there'd be too much error, and so they wouldn't be a good feeder. And my view is you absolutely want the error.
Yeah. The bit I love is fully grown adults serving perfect right foot hooks to a 4-year-old goalkeeper. And it's like, well, 4-year-olds don't shoot like that. The information involved in that shot is different, and it's like 4-year-olds shoot in strange ways. So get the 4-year-olds to shoot the goalkeeper, or just sack goalkeeping off at that age because it's essentially redundant anyway.
Yeah. Don't be doing. I've seen adverts for the specialist under sevens goalkeeping camps. Just be a footballer and have a go every now and again. Yeah, I get it.
Learn how the ball moves and interacts, and then start to keep it out of a goal rather than receiving.
Well, if anything we're seeing about the modern goalkeeper, let's take Edison or Alisson or any of those. And to a certain extent, he's probably less in favour at the moment, but someone like Jordan Pickford, right? I mean, one of the things that they do is they give their teams a tactical advantage because of their ability to kick the ball with accuracy. I mean, Edison's just off the chart, isn't he? I mean, they always talk about him. He could be a midfielder.
He could happily play centre midfield for Burnley, and I'd be delighted.
But I mean, the advantage that gives a side to, because like if a tide comes and tries to press you, you've got a goalkeeper who can say, all right, well, this will just go straight out to the wing back. Yeah. And he'll hit them every time.
We saw the first 10 minutes of the Liverpool-Barcelona game when Liverpool were playing well. They broke out so many times because they just used Alisson over the front three's head and they'd start to build an attack. Yeah. That's fascinating.
It's a great way to. I mean, I noticed England doing it I think it was in the Euros, wasn't it? Yeah. I noticed them doing it when teams would come and press, and they'd actually deliberately they'd play the ball out from the back. Teams would come onto them and press. They'd deliberately play the ball back to Pickford, and then Pickford would pick a 50-yard pass to somebody on the wing, and off we went. Yeah, it's a great tactic when you think about it. Because if the team drops off, you play it in. If they don't drop off, you're in business, aren't you?
I'd love to be a fly on the wall at Man City's goalkeeper training, and see how much of it is spent in compost corner, as Nick Levitt calls it.
Compost corner.
And how much is actually embedded with the rest of the squad in functional training sessions.
Compost corner.
I mean, I loved compost corner as a player. I basically got to spend 2 hours doing very little.
Yeah, rolling around in the mud, using your hands, yeah. But interestingly, just coming back to the idea of goalkeeper training and all that sort of stuff, or goalkeeper, I'm going to say coaching, not training, because I think a lot of it is training, and it shouldn't be training because we're not animals. it's goalkeeper coaching. The bit that I also think is often missing is the decision-making component. So for me, like, even if it's a variable feed, right? So, and don't get me wrong, there is scope for that, right? There's scope for just saving the ball, save the ball. Yeah, good, loads of stuff, lots of variability in the feed, etc., delivered by an appropriate individual with the appropriate level of skill, with the appropriate level of movement, etc., as much as you possibly can, as representative as you can get. But even that is isolated of the decision-making component, because for me, it's not often. I'm trying to think about this now, but I always think there's often a scenario where I see an awful lot of wrong phrase. But I see decisions made by goalkeepers that can't be based on available information. So, for example, you often see a keeper, like, say, coming out to close down and getting lobbed, and you think to yourself, you've just kind of gone for that. You've just guessed a bit,
or
because you had
not been in that environment enough in training.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. Because that's what I mean. Is like, they've gone for it, thought, it might be panic or whatever, but there's a defender there, so it's kind of not really necessary. Yeah, actually, you'd have been better off staying where you were, letting your defender trying to deal with it, and then if you rifled it in the top corner, good goal. As it is, you've kind of made it easy. Yeah,
I think the goalkeeper at my club, his shot stopping is phenomenal. He'll save pretty much anything from pretty much anywhere. But when he does make his errors, then normally that example there where he gets beaten to the ball because he's started late or has had his positioning wrong, and it might be because in training he's not embedded in the sessions enough, or don't work on those patterns or phases enough. It could be that reason. But it's goalkeepers are all very good shot stoppers. Trials or training sessions to choose goalkeepers always done around shot stopping. Very little goalkeeper actions are really about shot stopping, and I think a lot of shots would be saved more comfortably if there was a more substantial focus on your positioning in relation to the moving ball. Yeah, a lot of positioning stuff is done on static occurrences. Yeah, but we know that I don't remember ever standing still as a goalkeeper when the ball was in my own half, constantly readjusting to patterns and players moving and the ball moving. Yeah. We just don't do enough of that in goalkeeping. You see it a lot, don't you? Because obviously they love to minutely analyse every single goal that goes in and what the goalkeeper did wrong. But you see it a lot. They make point of that. They make the step to the left, which means they then can't get to the ball. Yeah. Now, again, I'm not saying that wouldn't have happened in any other situation, but it feels to me again that somebody who is more attuned perceptually to the relevant information probably wouldn't be making a anticipatory move. It's essentially they've been fooled. They've kind of guessed and been fooled. The other one that's a really big one for me, that if I would spend hours doing this, which is the goal when they whip in a free kick from the let's say the left hand side, right footed, whip it in, right, and nobody gets a head on it, but it still goes in at the far post because the keeper's sort of going for the anticipatory header, and they're late to get to it. That's a big one for me. That's clear. You can't. I mean, I would be trying to help a goalkeeper to develop a strategy or an approach, a tactical approach to dealing with those situations, because they happen a lot. Yeah, it is a difficult one, that, because I guess if they don't look for the deflection or the header and when it goes in, they look daft. If they do leave it expecting it, and that's a difficult one, that is. Well, so the question I would pose a goalkeeper in that situation, if I was coaching you, I would say, what's the primary task? Yeah. And the primary task is for the ball not to go in directly. That's the primary task, isn't it? Because if that happens, that was really easy. Now, for me, because I would then say, well, there are other people involved in stopping this ball going in, right? So if our defenders don't head the ball effectively or defend the ball effectively, and a geezer gets a bullet header and it goes in the other corner, and you've stayed central to stop the ball going directly in, that's the lesser of two evils as far as I was concerned. Whereas if I guess and then it goes in the far post, you know what I mean? It's then the goalkeeper's fault. Yeah, no, that makes sense. Not just fault. I just think, what's the primary task? Yeah, and it's to Okay, no, it's interesting.
But I guess there's just different ways of looking at it. I mean, I'd probably get hate mail now from the goalkeepers union about I'm totally wrong and I should be going for the headers. but equally, there's no guarantee. You know what? The other thing for me as well is when that ball's coming in at pace, right? It only takes a very small touch to be able to completely immobilize the keeper. Yeah, exactly. Right. So again, this might be to do with gaze, where the gaze is, but the ball's coming in, you're tracking, right? They're tracking the ball in, and it's going to take a deflection and it's going to adjust. So either when it's clearly perceptual attunement, right? Either there's something's happening where they're going, it's going in there, I'm going for that, oh, it's gone in there, right? Or it's coming in, and there just isn't enough time to adjust. So my point being is this, right? The one thing I know I could probably deal with is that ball going straight in. One thing I know I might not be able to deal with is somebody getting a glancing header or a hard header, because even if I was even if I anticipated properly, there's no guarantee I can stop it.
No, especially from that distance. Yeah, virtually impossible to respond at that moment and save it unless it's next to you.
Yeah. And so that's for me where I would probably play. But it's just a strategic thing. Like I used to do the same thing with hockey goalkeepers, right? Every now and again, coaching at National League level, we'd come up against like some ex-Pakistani international or current Pakistani international, because the side's paid him $20,000 to come and play for them for one season to get them up, and all that jazz happens all the time. Anyway, and he can flick the ball like a bullet, right, off a penalty corner, right? The key set piece in hockey where most goals are scored from. Vast majority of penalty corners are scored from a drag flick, and so I got a keeper, right, who's not spent enough time looking at this stuff, and the ball's going in like a bullet. He hasn't got a clue. He hasn't got a chance. There's no chance for him to react to this ball. Right, it's just the pace, etc., etc. So my view is, what strategic, tactical decision making, what tactical approach have you got that you might use to, I guess, make the odds slightly better in your favour? Quite often, there'd be some process of getting to this point, but what we'd arrive at might be, well, let's just make one half of the goal our goal, and we'll do our best to defend the other half. But on the basis that if it goes there, we'll say, well done. We probably wouldn't have saved that anyway. I'm just going to take this half of the goal out, right? But can I just tell you something? How hard it is for a goalkeeper to do that. It must be like an instinctive thing where they go, I'm not doing that. I'm going to go over here and stand in the middle and save it. Just step across there. Just step across and make that goal, that half goal. You can save it in that half goal. It's weird, isn't it?
Yeah, worry about the interactions. Yeah, it makes sense if there's... And I imagine we know the better players are more deceptive in their actions.
Yeah.
So, reduce the size of the goal, just make him focus on the ones he can get attuned to those invariants. Yeah, that makes sense. And I think that's what goalkeeper training should be more about, is
the tactical side.
Yeah, reducing so that to the point where we can start to attune to the actual perceptual properties involved.
Yes.
And then we start to embed a bigger goal where we have to interact with the bigger space and know but once we've got those invariants, we can start worrying about the timing of our actions.
Yeah.
So I think that's where...
That's interesting as well. You talk about that. That's something I don't see enough done, which is keeping in a smaller goal or a bigger goal, or with different sized balls. I mean, I know different sized balls are used a lot more now. But that idea, actually, I mean, I use a lot with hockey goalkeeper training, do a lot of tennis ball stuff. But people use tennis rackets, and I'm like, no, hit it with hockey stick. Give them at least that cue. I see loads of rebound nets being used. So I see the goalkeeper coach standing behind, throwing it against the net, and my little keeper's trying to react to this net thing, and it goes doing, and it's nothing like the kind of cue they need.
But the issue I've got is they say it's about reaction training.
Exactly.
But reactions are still relevant to information. You don't react on nothing.
Yeah.
You still react on information.
And that's where your research, as well as all the research in this anticipatory gaze behaviour stuff, for me is really powerful, because what it's saying to us is goalkeepers don't react to just the ball releasing off something. They're picking up on all the other perceptual cues, and don't try and train them without those perceptual cues in place.
It's just a massively time-constrained action. It's still an action. There's still information embedded in it. One thing I'm wary of is completely hammering goalkeeper coaches, but
No, we're not saying that. It's more just talking about ways in which we can improve practice. There's a lot of culturally resilient activities taking place out there, and Ed Corlin talked about culturally resilient beliefs. We're doing a lot of stuff just because we think it's the right thing to do. But actually, if we look at your research and others who are in the field, and actually if we look at this from through an ecological lens and think about representative task design, then it makes no. I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm happy to have novelty. I'm happy for players to, I know when I do cricket this afternoon, this evening, when I go out to do that, if I got some springy things out and the kids would have a whale of a time playing with them, and they would probably get something out of it as well, and they'd create games and it'd be enjoyable. Don't get me wrong. I've got no problem about that, but I'm not pretending that that's about skill development.
Yeah, okay, no, yeah. Because a lot of goalkeepers, if you're full-time, for example, you can't be doing representative stuff every moment of the day. So I think that's where we need to...
But let's just be honest about it.
Yeah, the criticism of ecological dynamics militants is throwing for games only, which is a complete farce because no one's ever said that ever at any point. I mean, one of my biggest issues with goalkeeper training, I don't coach adult goalkeepers anymore, but was they just want me to volley it from 8 yards at them because they just want to get set. So, let's do that. No, I just want to do this, so I'm ready. I was like, well, okay, let's start to find a balance. And it's just about gradually moving them away from those culturally resilient beliefs or things that they focused on and they think prepare them for games, which is fine. But it's, I guess, trying to gradually push that away from, right, we'll do volleys for a few games, but then we'll start doing it from the floor for the next few games. And then we'll start to have the ball moving a little bit for the next few games and just go gradual drip feed. Because a lot of goalkeeping, I think, is cultural, which is why it's so difficult to change.
Well, interestingly, there's a whole fascinating area of study there that I've not seen any research in, which is habitual athlete ritual that they perceive as being important for performance. And I think it's no more than superstition.
Oh, I think we've all done it. I used to warm up for 5 minutes and about 4 shots, 4 of those volleys. If I say 4, then I'll go and sit down for half an hour. But it's every player I've ever known has had some weird trait or behaviour or just routine that they do, which there's got to be no sense in it.
Well, don't get me wrong, there's a superstition element, which is like, I need to do it in this format, in this way, otherwise my head's going to fall off type of thing. Yeah. But also, I think they genuinely believe that's going to help them with their performance. So the idea of, I want something with minimal variability that I'll be successful at several times, which will then give me the confidence and the sense of comfort that I'm going to perform. And I would just want to try and work with anybody like that and say, but the goal of our I'd rather you didn't do anything. The goal of your preparatory time perhaps ought to be the opposite of that. The goal of your preparatory time ought to be to get you firing and attuned as much as possible to get you into a state of readiness to be able to perform under stress.
Especially goalkeeping. I mean, you might have nothing to do for 10 minutes and then receive an absolute bullet on the volley from the edge of the box.
Yeah.
You've not had any of that experience in the warm-up. You've not attuned to the ball moving relative to the pitch before it being received. Loads of things.
I mean, if I do goalkeeper warm-up, I think they hate it because they always want to go and we're in a corner, right? Compost corner. But I go in a corner, and because then they can kick clear then, right? And they can kick to the sides. I never want them to kick it straight at me. Kick it to the sides, and the balls gather back, and then we can just keep feeding. But they never get to stay still. They're always on the move. I always move them slightly. I always self-adjust them. I always I always wrong foot them. I'm always flicking the odd one. I'm always hitting the odd one. I'm always, and because I don't want them to just stand and receive and stand and receive and stand and receive. And certainly, I'm pretty certain they don't. Some of them do, but they twig onto it after pretty quickly.
We warm up in relation to being physiologically ready, but we very rarely warm up in relation to being perceptually attuned.
Yeah. So then immediately after that, it's right now in there, going to goal, and we've got a 4v4 on.
Straight in. Yeah. Straight to the.
So the warm up activity. Yeah, exactly. Straight into the cave. So I'll go, right, here you go. Loads of that. Right, now jump in there. Right. Now if you're not ready at that point,
no chance.
No chance. But it's great for my players as well because the hunters are in the hunting land doing their attacking shots and deflections and nudges, as opposed to what I see traditionally, which is we're going to stand in a queue, pass the ball around and smack the ball at the keeper.
Yeah. I've found that especially difficult this season because I've been working with players that are kind of late 20s, have built careers at this level and above, and they have their attitudes and behaviours, and it's worked for them. So I guess
even though it hasn't worked for them as many times as it has, but we only ever think about the times it has.
It has worked, yeah. We lose 8-0 one week, but it's right. We'll do it again next week. Same routine.
I can't tell you the amount of times, like for example, there's been a crash, go into a game, right? And this is relatively high level hockey. Crash on the motorway. We all arrive late. We're putting our shin pads on in the car, run straight onto the pitch, smash the opposition 6-0.
Have an absolute blinder, yeah.
Yeah, or we arrive an hour and a half before, we have a proper debrief, we go into our warm-up routine, everybody's ready, and we lose 4-1. And we've gone 3-0 down in the first 5 minutes. And I think it's to do with the fact that the arousal level.
Yeah.
And I just think this preparatory stuff, anyway, we've got another rabbit hole. Listen, I could talk to you all day. We could talk goalkeeping all day. It's a fascinating area for me. I love coaching keepers. I don't get to do it enough, and part of me thinks I maybe ought to make it a bit of a specialism because I find myself quite fascinated by your stuff.
Yeah,
you can probably tell. We haven't even talked about some of the battles that have been fought, scars from Twitter sphere with eco-D militants, or we're eco-D militants, aren't we?
I think I'm fun.
the aggressors of the eco-D space. You've got some brilliant threads on Twitter that I highly recommend if you want to understand things like affordances and stuff. There's some fantastic threads that you're worth reading through. How do people find you on Twitter?
Generally okay.
No, I mean, where do they find you? What's your handle?
Where? This is when.
Yeah. I know.
Find me at I can't remember what it is. Ben_Franks1, I believe, and just any argument about ecology and coaching, and I'll likely be in there. So.
Yeah, you're a bit like me, aren't you? People dangle carrots in front of you, and I'm going to have to bite on that, I'm afraid. However much my rational brain, my system 2 goes, no, don't do it. No, the old lizard brain comes in, and then the next thing, 5 hours have passed, and I haven't done enough work. Anyway, listen, Ben, I've really enjoyed having you on. It's great. I'm glad we were able to do this. I'm really looking forward to seeing the stuff you're going to come out with in the next phase of your research. And I know the stuff you're doing on a day-to-day basis is going to be really interesting as well, where you're working now. So hopefully we can do this again sometime.
Yeah, definitely. It's been great. It's cool. Thanks, mate.
Cheers.
Thanks for listening to the Talent Equation podcast. If you like the show, then please consider supporting it by leaving a review on your favorite podcast player, telling your friends about it, or even becoming a hero and show your appreciation by becoming a patron. Just head over to thetalentequation.co.uk and click on the Becoming a Patron button at the top of the page.
Well, there you have it. Wow. What? That was definitely a conversation of two halves right there, I think. First half, obviously, I was geeking out on the science and looking into the ins and outs of some of the world of ecological dynamics and really exploring with Ben some of the latest in the research and particularly focused in on the whole idea of the quiet eye and where we need to look when we're trying to anticipate or we're trying to look at targeting, what have you. I was really intrigued by the idea that that we're looking at how we look at things and where we look at things is quite individual, and there isn't necessarily an ideal model, which is very similar, I think, in terms of the way where we're looking at human development as well. The idea of ideal technical forms isn't necessarily the way we need to be thinking about this. This is quite an individualized thing, and it's about supporting people to find approaches and solutions that are going to work for them. So very much in keeping with that theme. But what that means for us is that, in terms of as practitioners and coaches, is that our goal doesn't become here's the technical solution that you need. It becomes more let's explore how you will best perform and what the approaches that you're going to use are going to be the best for you. Wow. Yeah, new every day's a school day, as they say. Just one final thing quickly. Conclave is open. There's some new people joined, and we've had some fantastic discussions at the last conclave, and it would be good to have a few more of you join us. So if you want to get involved with that, head over to the website and click on the Become a Patron button, and you'll see the option to join the conclave. It'd be great to have you with us. In the meantime, have a great week of coaching, and remember, ditch those drills.